Before we begin, do subscribe to the Romance Shelf for stories that stir the soul and awaken forgotten desires. Lady Eleanor Whitmore had never imagined that the night of her own debut could feel like a funeral. The music swelled in grand, gilded hallways, yet each note rang hollow against the cavern of her heart. She stood beneath the glare of 100 expectant eyes, the lace of her gown pressing cold against her skin, and realized with sudden, piercing clarity that she was already buried beneath the weight of a life dictated by others. Whispers slipped like daggers from behind embroidered fans. The Earl's daughter, promised to the insipid Lord Halwell, yet she glances at him as if the world were not enough. Eleanor's cheeks burned. The whispers were truth-coated in honey meant to wound. Her father, the formidable Earl of Ashbourne, had arranged this engagement as one arranges the passing of an heirloom, without tenderness, without question. The logic of title and property, of wealth and alliance, had eclipsed the fragile bloom of her own desire. And yet, there was a flicker of rebellion in Eleanor's chest, a spark that had been smoldering since the day she first encountered Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Ravenshire, whose absence had been prolonged by some mysterious exile, whose presence now returned to London with the weight of storm clouds behind him. She saw him first across the ballroom as though the entire assembly had paused for that single heartbeat. His gaze, dark and fathomless, swept over her with the precision of a hawk. Not a word, not a gesture, yet the intensity of his attention struck Eleanor as sharply as any physical blow. She had known him once, in a summer of reckless hope, when the world had seemed mercifully small, and laughter had been a currency freely spent. But he had left. He had vanished, leaving only letters unopened, promises unfulfilled, and a hollow ache that had grown with each passing season. The orchestra shifted, and Lord Cedric Halwell stepped forward. His smile was courteous, practiced, insincere, a mask that draped over arrogance. He offered his hand, the gesture mechanical, and Eleanor felt the suffocating truth. She was expected to dance not with desire, but with duty. She took his hand, her fingers brushing briefly against the embroidered cuff of his sleeve, a contact colder than the frost that sometimes settled upon the moors. The first notes of the waltz filled the hall, and she moved with the grace demanded of her station, while her heart moved elsewhere, racing toward shadows of memory where Alexander had once whispered that she was free to be herself. A ripple of amusement passed through the assembly as Cedric led her in turn after turn. Guests leaned forward, fans fluttered, and Eleanor caught snippets of laughter threaded with scorn. "Poor Eleanor," someone murmured. "She cannot even feign delight. How dreadful it must be to be so beautiful and so helpless." The words cut deeper than any blade, for they were true. She was helpless, yes, but not in the way they imagined. She was helpless against the architecture of society, against the unyielding dictates of her father, against the suffocating expectations that bound her like chains invisible yet unbreakable. Alexander remained where he had first appeared, his presence a dark silhouette among the glittering throng. He did not step forward, he did not intervene. And yet, Eleanor sensed him in every movement, every faltering beat of her pulse. Her body obeyed Cedric's lead, but her mind and spirit defied the rhythm of propriety. She longed to run, to flee from this gilded prison, yet every instinct screamed caution, for scandal in London was not merely gossip. It was a blade that could slice through fortune, reputation, and dignity in a single, merciless stroke. As the waltz reached its apex, Cedric's hand brushed her shoulder in an exaggerated flourish, drawing a polite laugh from Eleanor that rang as hollow as the echo of a church bell in an empty nave. It was then that a small, knowing voice behind a fan spoke again. "Did you know the Duke of Ravenshire once loved her? They say he left because the world demanded it. How tragic, that love is never enough for duty." Eleanor's chest tightened. Every gaze now felt like fire, every whispered word, a match struck against tinder. The heat of shame mingled with the ache of desire, creating a conflagration she could neither douse nor contain. She had thought herself prepared, fortified by years of careful reading, gentle promenades, and the polite discourse of London society. But no preparation could have braced her for this moment, the collision of past and present, the stark realization that the world saw her as a possession while her heart recognized no law but its own longing. The music waned, and the waltz came to an end, but Eleanor did not release Cedric's hand with the expected courtesy. She stepped back slowly, feeling her gown swirl like water around her, and met Alexander's gaze once more. His eyes held questions, accusations, and unspoken entreaties all at once. A servant brushed past, bearing a note sealed with the Duke's crest. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she plucked it from the tray. She dared not open it in the glare of the ballroom, but the weight of its presence pressed upon her like a secret too long hidden. Cedric's smile faltered slightly, perceptive enough to recognize that this was no ordinary token. Whispers shifted again, circling her like predators drawn to prey. The hall seemed to constrict around her, walls narrowing, chandeliers tilting toward her as if conspiring to expose the truth she could not yet voice. And then, in the midst of polite applause and the murmurs of judgment, Eleanor felt a strange, fleeting surge of defiance. Perhaps it was the memory of Alexander's warm hands, the stolen glances on sunlit terraces, the words they had never spoken aloud but had lived between them like a sacred covenant. Perhaps it was the knowledge that a single choice, one bold, reckless choice, could shatter the carefully constructed cage of her life. Her fingers curled around the envelope, and though she did not yet open it, she knew that the night had shifted irrevocably. Eleanor turned her eyes toward Alexander one last time before the crowd began to disperse, and in that brief electric second, the world fell away. He did not move, did not speak, yet the entire weight of longing and regret and possibility seemed to radiate from him. And then, as the chandelier's light glimmered like judgment in the eyes of the tun, a sudden sharp note of fear, mingled with hope, coursed through her. She was caught between what was expected and what was forbidden, and the first step toward freedom had already begun. The letter remained in her hand, cold yet alive, and Eleanor realized with a quiet, undeniable certainty. The path she had always feared to tread was now calling her by name. The moment arrived when silence could kill, and in Eleanor's chamber, it nearly did. The candle's flame trembled as though it feared what she would do next, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across her trembling hands. She held the envelope Alexander had sent, the wax seal cold and inflexible beneath her fingers, and felt as if she were clutching a living thing. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, a storm against the fragile veneer of civility that London demanded. Each breath she drew seemed borrowed, each thought a treason against duty. She had been raised to obey, to smile, to endure, yet here she sat on the edge of rebellion, the boundaries of her carefully constructed world crumbling in the quietest of ways. The letter was brief, its words sparse yet incandescent with meaning. If ever you wish to be free, come north. Ravenshire awaits. She had read it a dozen times, each repetition igniting a new flicker of both terror and hope. Freedom was a dangerous thing. It demanded courage she had never known she possessed, courage to defy her father, defy the tun, defy everything she had been trained to uphold. The locket within the envelope pressed cold against her chest, a tiny violet, dried and perfect, its fragrance faint but unmistakable. She traced its delicate petals with a finger, as if by touch alone she could summon the years of affection and longing that had been kept secret, hidden from the prying eyes of the world. But the world had its own plans. News traveled faster than any carriage, and rumor, once unleashed, was impossible to recapture. That evening, a whisper came to her ears carried by the daughter of a friend of her mother's. "Did you hear? The Duke of Ravenshire has not forgotten Lady Eleanor. They say she received a token from him tonight, a violet pressed in wax. The poor girl flirts with ruin merely by breathing." Eleanor's breath caught. She had anticipated judgment, but never so immediate, so intimate, so sharp that it cut through the protective lattice of her private room. Her cheeks flushed with shame, but beneath it surged a defiant thrill, the first real spark of agency she had ever felt. She thought of Alexander, imagining him on his moors, cloaked against the northern winds, watching for her decision with a patience that only magnified her desire. Every detail of him, every rigid line of jaw and shadowed brow, returned to her mind in painful, exquisite clarity. He had once loved her openly, fiercely, and then vanished, leaving the cruel absence of duty as a chasm between them. And now, through a single letter and a single flower, he had reopened that chasm, daring her to cross it, daring her to act, daring her to live. The servant who delivered the letter lingered, her curiosity palpable. Eleanor's pulse quickened at the thought of discovery. If the wrong eyes glimpsed this correspondence, her life as it had been known would be irrevocably altered. She tucked the locket beneath her gown and hid the envelope in the folds of her skirts, feeling the weight of its promise press against her heart. The servant lingered a heartbeat too long, and Eleanor realized that even the smallest misstep could unravel her with terrifying speed. The air in the chamber was thick, a tangible presence that seemed to tighten around her ribs with every heartbeat. She paced, restless, torn between indecision and resolve. She had known restraint all her life, yet every fiber of her being now screamed for movement, for action, for flight. Thoughts of Lord Cedric, polite, infuriating, and hollow, rose unbidden. He would never understand her, never see the hunger for authenticity that Alexander alone had recognized. She imagined the elegant ballroom in London, now silent to her ears, filled with noble observers who would never comprehend the life teetering on the edge of her hands. And in that imagining she felt the full weight of choice, the terrifying, intoxicating possibility that she could choose herself over expectation. Outside, the night pressed close against the windows, the streets empty save for the occasional carriage rattling over cobblestones. Eleanor's gaze lingered on the city beyond, a labyrinth of order, of propriety, of judgment, and she realized that she was already separate from it. The letter had severed the final tether to her former existence. Alexander's words pulsed through her mind like a heartbeat in the dark. Come north. North to freedom, north to danger, north to the man whose love had never truly left her. Her hand tightened on the envelope and she felt a shiver that was not cold, but something more, something like awakening. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of a knock at the chamber door. Eleanor froze. Visitors at this hour were never benign, and her pulse leapt with the anticipation of scandal. She opened the door just enough to glimpse the footman's uneasy bow, a tray in his hands. Upon it rested a small bouquet of violets tied with a black ribbon, and another note, simpler, briefer. The choice is yours. Do not let them cage your heart. Eleanor's breath caught, and a tremor ran through her fingers as she accepted the gift. This second token, so intimate, so deliberate, was not merely a declaration. It was a command, a summons, a promise that the storm of consequence would be met with the storm of his protection. She sank into a chair, cradling the flowers as though they were a talisman, a link to the man who had once loved her and who now dared her to love him in return. Every instinct of propriety screamed against it. Every lesson of obedience warned that her father's wrath would be swift and merciless, that the tongue would brand her scandalous, that the crown itself could disapprove. Yet beneath the fear, beneath the societal chains, a singular, crystalline thought emerged. If she stayed, she would die in a gilded cage. If she left, she would risk everything, but perhaps at last she would live. She imagined Alexander on his moors, rain-streaked and resolute, waiting for her, and the locket in her hand seemed suddenly to burn. The night stretched infinitely before her, heavy with possibility and peril alike. Eleanor's decision had not yet been made, but the path was already visible. She rose, brushing her skirts, her heart hammering with the first true courage of her life. The world might condemn her, the tongue might whisper, her father might rage, but she would answer only to the quiet, fierce voice within her chest. And as she placed the locket close to her heart and folded the letters into the hidden depths of her gown, Eleanor understood that the first step of her flight had already begun, not in carriage or horse, nor even in the northern wind, but in the brave, quiet act of daring to imagine a life claimed by desire rather than duty. The night waited, patient and infinite, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Alexander's dark eyes searched the moors, certain that she would come. The storm tore across the moors as if the heavens themselves conspired against her, and Eleanor Whitmore knew with every bone in her body that she had never been more alive, or more vulnerable. Her carriage, overturned by the wrath of wind and rain, lay in splintered ruin, the horses fled, and the world she had fled from seemed a distant, unreachable memory. She shivered, soaked to the skin, the chill gnawing through the layers of lace and velvet that had once been her armor. Every rational thought whispered that she should fear, that the night would claim her, yet beneath the terror surged a fierce, unyielding pulse of determination. She had chosen this path, dared the impossible, and now there was no retreat. The moors stretched like an endless, black ocean, each gust of wind slicing at her with merciless precision. She stumbled forward, boots sinking into sodden earth, eyes straining through the sheets of rain that blurred the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she saw a dark figure, motionless against the storm, and her heart leapt with both hope and apprehension. Could it be a specter, a dream, or the one man who had haunted every corner of her memory? The figure moved with the measured certainty of command, and the wind carried a whisper of something familiar, an aura of power and restraint, of shadow and promise. Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Ravenshire, appeared as if conjured by her desperate longing. He was astride a black stallion, cloak whipping around him like the storm itself, eyes dark pools that drank in the tempest and then settled upon her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. No words passed between them at first. Speech would have been superfluous, inadequate. He dismounted with the precision of a man who had faced countless storms and survived, each motion deliberate, controlled, yet undeniably urgent. Eleanor's knees threatened to buckle, but she stood, rooted by both fear and the inexorable pull of recognition. The distance closed, and with each step the past surged into the present. He had left her once, sacrificed their summer of stolen moments on the altar of duty, and she had endured the ache of absence, believing her heart would shatter beneath the weight of propriety. And yet, here he was, more imposing, more vital than memory had allowed, an unspoken apology in the rigid set of his shoulders, a question in the fire of his gaze. Her own voice caught, fragile against the roar of wind, "Alexander." The single name was both plea and confession, trembling on her lips like a prayer to a god who might have abandoned them both. He knelt before her, not in submission, but in the tender gravity of recognition. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and measured, carrying the weight of every regret, every longing, every secret that had festered in silence. "You should not be here. The world, it would not forgive this." His words, meant as warning, ignited a storm within her that rivaled the one without. She had fled London, abandoned her betrothal, and yet she felt no remorse, only the fierce, intoxicating certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The rain drummed on them, relentless and indifferent, yet in that torrential symphony, there was a strange intimacy, a cocoon of shared desperation. Eleanor's fingers brushed against his sleeve, tentative at first, then with a bolder certainty born of months spent longing for a touch denied. He responded with equal delicacy, hands steady, guiding her to shelter beneath the hooded embrace of his cloak. They were drenched, shivering, yet it mattered little. The storm outside mirrored the tempest within them, but here at least they could stand together. Words, when they came, were confessions rather than declarations. Eleanor spoke first, her voice cracking under the weight of pent-up emotion. "I could not stay. I would have died in that gilded cage, Alexander. Every whisper, every glance, every smile that was not mine to give, it was a torment." He listened, eyes never leaving hers, the intensity of his gaze an anchor in the chaos. When he finally spoke, it was with the deliberate calm that had always drawn her to him, a voice that could both command and soothe. "And I believed leaving you would protect you. But now I see it has done the opposite. You are mine, Eleanor, whether the world acknowledges it or not." The proximity, the confessions, the storm, each element collided, raw and unfiltered, until they were no longer simply man and woman, but two halves of a single desperate longing. She felt the brush of his hand against her cheek, the steadiness of his palm anchoring her in the maelstrom of wind and water, and the years of solitude and propriety melted like ice. Eleanor realized that love, once dormant, was a force beyond regulation, beyond logic, beyond punishment. It demanded recognition, action, surrender. Yet reality intruded with the subtlety of a blade. The moors, beautiful and brutal, were not a sanctuary, they were a prelude to peril. Every mile north was fraught with the risk of discovery, every passing hour a potential scandal that could ruin her forever. Eleanor's breath hitched as she imagined the consequences. Her father's fury, the ton's scorn, the crown's disapproval. But beside Alexander, fear was tempered by the thrill of survival, by the promise of agency. She was no longer simply a noblewoman obeying orders, she was a participant in her own destiny, reckless but alive. He drew her closer under the shelter of his cloak, and for a brief, suspended moment, they were shielded from the storm, shielded from the world, shielded from everything but the undeniable truth of their connection. Alexander's lips hovered near her temple, and he whispered, not a vow but a certainty, "You have come. You have chosen." Her chest swelled with a mixture of relief, desire, and terror. Choosing him had been only the first step. The next, she realized, was far more dangerous. They began to move, Eleanor steadying herself against the broad expanse of his shoulder as they navigated the treacherous, rain-slicked terrain. Each step was a negotiation between caution and impulse, between necessity and the intoxicating liberation of proximity. The world beyond the moors seemed to shrink, insignificant against the raw immediacy of wind, rain, and whispered apologies. Eleanor allowed herself a fleeting smile, not of victory but of recognition. She had crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. And yet, even as they advanced together, the moors themselves seemed to warn them. Shadows flickered in the periphery, the cries of distant birds pierced the darkness, and Eleanor could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. Danger lingered beyond the immediacy of the storm, unseen but palpable, a reminder that freedom, however ardently seized, carried its own cost. Her fingers tightened on the edges of his cloak, seeking reassurance in its weight, in its promise of protection, in the inevitability of what was to come. As they paused atop a small rise, the wind tearing at them with renewed ferocity, Alexander's gaze swept the horizon, calculating, wary, unyielding. "We cannot stay," he murmured. "There are eyes that would see you returned, ears that would hear every choice we make. You are not safe, not yet. But you will be, Eleanor. If you trust me. Her heart leapt, fragile and fierce, tethered entirely to the man who had once been her everything and now claimed her again with the authority of both storm and tenderness. And in that charged, shivering silence, Eleanor understood the irrevocable truth. The Moors had delivered her into the arms of the man she had loved since youth, but they had also delivered her into a peril greater than she had yet imagined. The storm would pass, but the consequences of this reunion would follow them like shadows, waiting, patient and relentless. She met his gaze, unflinching despite the cold, the rain, the risk, and she knew that whatever awaited beyond this night, she would face it with him. And somewhere beyond the horizon, hidden by mist and shadow, the first stirrings of danger began to take shape, a silent herald of the trials yet to come. The knock came like a judgment, echoing through the great hall of Ravenshire Manor, each strike a hammer against Eleanor's fragile calm. The storm outside had abated, but inside, tension brewed hotter than any tempest. Alexander Hawthorne stood at the center of the room, rigid as a statue carved from grief and determination, his cloak damp and heavy, his eyes a storm unto themselves. Eleanor felt the tremor in her fingers, the pulse racing like a drum in her chest. This was the confrontation she had anticipated, feared, and yet somehow welcomed. The world itself had come to reclaim her, and Alexander would not yield. The door swung open, and the Earl of Ashbourne entered, tall, imperious, and filled with indignation that seemed older than the walls of the manor itself. Beside him, the crown's envoy observed silently, a spectre of authority whose presence demanded obedience and compliance. Eleanor's breath caught. She had fled London to escape precisely this moment, to evade the suffocating demands of title and duty, yet here it was, standing unyielding as if fate had pursued her across moors and storms. Every instinct screamed to hide, to apologize, to submit, yet she could not. She had chosen a path of courage, and now she would follow it to its inevitable collision. Alexander's gaze swept the hall, measuring every expression, every slight, every threat veiled beneath the veneer of civility. His voice, calm yet edged with steel, broke the silence. You may come for her, but you will not take her from me. It was not a challenge to blood or rank. It was a statement, a decree that love, though often silent and subdued, could be more binding than law. The Earl's eyes narrowed, his pride wounded by both defiance and insolence. Duke Hawthorne, he said, each word sharpened by indignation, you cannot presume to defy me or the will of the crown. Lady Eleanor is mine by duty, by promise, by every principle you have ignored. Eleanor stepped forward, the weight of her own conviction rising like a tide against the storm of authority. Father, she said, voice steady though trembling beneath the surface, I am no longer a possession. I am not to be given, bartered, or commanded. My life, my choice, belongs to me alone. The room seemed to shrink in response to her words, the walls closing in as though shocked by her audacity. The Earl's jaw tightened. He had never encountered resistance like this from his daughter, and the realization seemed to age him in a heartbeat. Alexander moved closer to her, his presence a shield against both judgment and wrath. His hand brushed hers, subtle, deliberate, and Eleanor felt the familiar spark of recognition, the silent language of devotion that required no words. She speaks the truth, he said, voice like velvet stretched over steel. I will not bend, not for the ton, not for the crown, not for anyone who seeks to claim her without consent. She is hers to command as she should have always been. The room held its collective breath. Authority had been challenged before, but never with such unyielding clarity, never with such poetic audacity. The Earl's face flushed crimson. You dare lecture me on propriety? He demanded. Do you forget the consequences of scandal? The ruin that awaits should the ton, or worse the crown, discover her absence? Do you not understand that love cannot shield one from duty? Alexander's reply was measured, yet each word struck with the precision of a sword. I understand perfectly. I also understand that obedience without desire is no life at all. And Eleanor deserves to live, not merely exist. Eleanor's chest heaved with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had fled the chains of expectation, only to discover that freedom demanded confrontation, demanded courage, demanded defiance against everything she had been taught to revere. Yet in Alexander's gaze she found a steadfast promise, a silent vow that whatever storms awaited, he would meet them with her, shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart. She dared to lift her chin, to stand as the woman she had never allowed herself to be, to speak with authority untempered by fear. I will not return to London. I will not marry Lord Cedric. I will live by my choice and I will love by my heart. If the world deems this scandal, let it do so. I will not yield. The hall seemed suspended in disbelief. The earl's fists clenched, the envoy's pen hovered, poised to record infraction and defiance alike. Alexander's eyes softened slightly, the first trace of relief flickering across his storm-darkened features. He moved closer to Eleanor, their shoulders brushing, a subtle act of unity and strength. Then we face the world together, he said. Let them judge. Let them whisper. We will endure what they cannot comprehend. The simplicity of the declaration belied its enormity. In its elegance, it carried both rebellion and devotion, the quiet yet potent force of two souls aligned against the weight of society. The earl's voice cracked with a mixture of fury and desperation. You will not ruin everything I have built. You will not. His words faltered as Alexander stepped forward, unwavering, the room's air thick with the intensity of his presence. I will not ruin what is yours, Alexander interrupted calmly, because it was never yours to claim. Eleanor is not property. She is life. And life, once awakened, cannot be restrained. The clarity of the statement cut through the tension like a blade, leaving silence in its wake. Eleanor's gaze swept the room, meeting every skeptical eye, every judgmental glare, and for the first time she felt the intoxicating weight of power. Not the power of title, not the power of wealth, not the hollow dominion of society, but the power of choice, of agency, of heart. Alexander's hand found hers, the contact grounding her, affirming that she did not stand alone. The storm outside, the storm within, the storm of expectation, they would endure it together. The silence stretched, pregnant with possibility and threat, and then, as though testing the limits of their courage, the crown's envoy spoke. The matter will not end here. You may defy your father tonight, Duke, but the consequences of rebellion are not so easily evaded. Your names and hers will carry the weight of scandal across England. Eleanor drew a slow breath, unafraid now, and her voice rang clear, firm and unwavering. Then let the world bear witness. I will not bend. I will not hide. And I will not regret the choice I have made. Alexander's eyes softened, shadowed with the faintest trace of a smile. He drew her closer, shielding her not from duty but from doubt, from fear, from the lingering echoes of a world determined to impose its will. Tonight we claim what is ours, he said quietly. Tomorrow we endure what must be endured. But no storm, no judgment, no decree can sever what has been awakened between us. Eleanor felt the truth of the words in every pulse, every breath, every fiber of her being. And as they stood together, the storm outside spent but the storm of consequence only beginning, Eleanor realized with a shiver that freedom had a cost, and that love, pure, unyielding, defiant love, was never without its trials. The night had shifted, irrevocable and eternal, and with it the lives of both Eleanor Whitmore and Alexander Hawthorne would never be the same. Yet somewhere, beyond the walls of Ravenshire Manor, in the quiet shadows that lingered even after the fury of confrontation, a new threat stirred, silent, patient and relentless, waiting to test the strength of a love that had already defied everything the world demanded. The dawn tore itself from the horizon as if the world itself could no longer contain its grief. Eleanor Whitmore awoke to the cries of gulls over the cliffs, the wind still sharp from the night storm, and felt a strange, hollow ache, a residue of fear mingled with anticipation. The trials of London, the confrontation with her father, the perilous flight across the moors, all of it had led to this moment, fragile, fleeting, yet immense in its weight. She rose from the damp straw of the carriage, brushing her skirts against the chill of the morning, and felt the unmistakable certainty that the choice she had made, however dangerous, had been irrevocable. Alexander Hawthorne waited, silent as a shadow, his cloak still damp, hair plastered to his brow by the relentless wind. The Duke's eyes, dark pools reflecting storm clouds and dawn light alike, met hers with unspoken questions, unspoken apologies and unspoken promises. Eleanor drew in a steadying breath, feeling the pulse of her heart hammering in tandem with the crashing waves far below the cliffs. She had never been more alive and never more exposed. Freedom, she realized, was both exhilarating and terrifying, the boundaries between triumph and tragedy thinner than a breath. The chapel awaited, perched precariously upon the cliff's edge, humble and austere, yet sacred in its isolation. Its doors creaked as they entered, the scent of damp stone and candle smoke mixing with the salty tang of the sea. Here, away from London's prying eyes, away from the judgment of family and society, they could speak the truth that had long lived in stolen glances and half-whispered words. Eleanor's fingers found Alexander's as they walked up the narrow aisle, their steps hesitant yet resolute, the rhythm of their hearts synchronizing with every echoing footfall. She dared to glance up at him. Is it real? She whispered, voice fragile against the chapel's stillness. After everything, can we, be real? Alexander's lips curved in a slow, almost imperceptible smile. As real as the cliffs beneath our feet, he replied, voice low, reverent, carrying both the weight of their past and the hope of their future. As real as the storm that brought you to me. I swore to protect you then, to wait for you, and now I swear to claim nothing less than your heart, wholly and without reservation. They reached the altar, the sea stretching endless behind the chapel's small windows, and Eleanor felt the thrill of vertigo, both from the height of the cliffs and the enormity of what she was about to do. No ceremony, no worldly sanction could make this less dangerous, yet it was precisely the danger that gave it power. Alexander lifted her hands, palms warm, steady, and for the first time Eleanor allowed herself to feel the depth of their shared history, the summer laughter, the parting that had left her hollow, the letters unspoken, the longing suppressed. Every moment had led here, each heartbeat a prelude to revelation. I will not wait another day, he murmured, voice breaking with the quiet intensity that had always drawn her to him. Eleanor, will you be mine, not in obedience, not in title, but in heart, in soul, in every breath we draw together? Her response was instinctive, desperate, and inevitable. Yes, she breathed, voice trembling yet resolute. Yes, Alexander. I am yours as I have always been in every hidden corner of my life, in every hope, in every dream. The words hung between them, sacred, unrepeatable, and then he drew her close, the first touch of lips upon lips that had been denied, deferred, and yet never forgotten. It was not a kiss of passion alone, but of reconciliation, of defiance, of a love that had been forged in absence and hardened by longing. Eleanor pressed herself to him, feeling the steadiness of his heart beneath her palm, the solidity of his arms encasing her, shielding her from the world's judgment. In that instant all fear, all propriety, all expectation fell away, leaving only the raw, incandescent truth of their union. They parted slightly, foreheads resting together, breath mingling in the damp morning air. Alexander's voice was low, almost reverent. The world may see scandal where we see truth. They may condemn our choice, but nothing can undo what has been awakened here. Eleanor's lips curved in a faint, triumphant smile, the first unguarded expression of joy she had permitted herself in months. Then let them see, she whispered, let them speak. We are no longer bound by their rules. Only by our hearts. Yet even in the midst of this fragile euphoria, reality intruded, subtle but inexorable. The moors were not entirely empty. The cliffs, however isolated, could not shield them from the long reach of society. Eleanor's gaze drifted beyond the altar to the jagged horizon, and in the distance she thought she glimpsed a shadow, swift, fleeting but unmistakable. Her pulse quickened, a warning her senses refused to ignore. Danger had not vanished with the dawn, it had merely become patient, watching, waiting for the slightest misstep. Alexander noticed her pause, his hand tightening gently around hers. Do not fear what has not yet arrived, he murmured, though the tension in his voice betrayed a measure of apprehension. Whatever comes, we face it together. Our choice cannot be undone. Eleanor nodded, trusting him implicitly, yet a shiver ran through her, not of cold but of premonition. The air, still heavy with the remnants of storm, seemed to hum with the promise of trials yet to come. They exchanged vows, quiet but unyielding, a pact forged in defiance of duty and in affirmation of love. Eleanor's words were deliberate, carrying the authority of someone who had finally claimed herself. I choose you. Not for wealth, not for title, not for convenience. For love. For life. For truth. Alexander's reply was equally potent, binding, a promise not merely spoken but felt in every fiber of his being. And I choose you, Eleanor Whitmore, as my equal, my partner, my heart's only sanctuary. Let the world know our defiance. Let it whisper and judge. We will endure because love at last commands us both. The wind swept through the chapel, rattling panes and carrying the scent of rain and salt. Eleanor pressed the locket to her chest, the violet inside crushed slightly by the fervor of her grip, and felt the continuity of memory and desire intertwining. Every act of courage, every stolen glance, every whispered longing, every risk she had taken, all of it had led to this moment of quiet triumph. Yet in triumph there is always tension, and in joy there is always the shadow of uncertainty. As they stepped from the chapel into the first fragile light of morning, Eleanor felt a thrill of liberation mingled with apprehension. The cliffs stretched before them, unguarded and untamed, a world both beautiful and dangerous, mirroring the path they had chosen. Alexander's arm encircled her waist, a protective and possessive gesture, and she leaned into him, savoring the solidity of his presence, the certainty of his devotion. And yet, just as the first rays of sun pierced the clouds, a distant figure appeared on the path below, a silhouette unmistakable and purposeful. Eleanor's heart skipped, a shiver running along her spine. The storm had ended, but the game of consequence had only begun.